college, I had a professor who required us in his Shakespeare class to scan lines of verse to mark metrical patterns, iambic pentameter, say, um, the primary line of Shakespeare in his sonnets and in his plays. And this was very challenging to me. I'd never scanned before. I'd never marked stressed syllables in a given line of poetry. Not only had I not done that, I had not tried to figure out how these metrical patterns reinforced the meaning of the poem. Well, by the end of that class, I did understand how to scan, and I did understand how scanning can reveal sonic or rhythmical aspects of the poem that may not be readily apparent on first or second or third reading. At the beginning of each class, this professor gave us a piece of paper with a passage from the play we read for that day, and he would say, okay, scan this and justify your choices for why you marked the accents you did, and then talk about how your justification contributes to an interpretation of this passage. This was extremely challenging in the early parts of the semester. I soon found out that this activity counted for 50% of the grade. Horrifying. Well, I'm really glad that this professor encouraged us to learn, because my appreciation for poetry has deepened considerably because I'm alert to metrical patterns. And I'm able to talk about how metrical patterns, rhythms of the lines, intensify meaning of the words, reinforce meaning, contradict the meaning. You have diction, word choice, a major part of a poem. You have syntax, word order, major part of a poem. You have rhyme, either end rhyme or internal rhyme, major parts of the poem. But we often overlook meter, which I would argue is just as important, because it reveals the rhythm that the poet invites us to use while reading the verse. And this rhythm can, again, reveal aspects of the verse that can only be revealed by the rhythm. And we will see this show up over and over again in this course. So as I said, for Shakespeare, the primary line, the line he liked the most, is iambic pentameter. That is 5 iambic feet. An iambic foot is 2 syllables. An iambic foot has a rhythm pattern. Da-da, da-da, da-da. Shakespeare wrote his sonnets in iambic pentameter. Milton wrote Paradise Lost in iambic pentameter. Wordsworth wrote his prelude in iambic pentameter. All English sonnets, all Petrarchan sonnets, iambic pentameter. Keats, many of his odes, iambic pentameter. It just seems to be a natural fit for the basic rhythm of the English language. Not only the da 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 da, but also maybe the 10 syllables has something to do with breath. Maybe it just sounds good. You can scan a lot of your favorite popular songs and you'll find a lot of pentameter, iambic pentameter, maybe iambic tetrameter. And the tetrameter shows up in one of your favorite poems, maybe Robert Frost, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. Now, I'm emphasizing this rhythm for purposes of illustration. We would not actually read the poem that way. In fact, there are some moments in the lines I just cited that are not perfect. Iambic pentameter, probably. One of the things that poets using this traditional meter learn pretty quickly is you have to vary the line, or your poem can become monotonous and mechanical. And we see a more pronounced variation on iambic pentameter in one of Shakespeare's most famous sonnets. I'm going to quote the first quatrain. I'm going to really emphasize that iambic pentameter, and you'll feel some awkwardness there. when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate. Now, if we look more closely, we'll see that the first line is not entirely in iambic pentameter. The first foot is in trochaic, da-da. You wouldn't say when in disgrace, you would say when in disgrace. And that when is an example of a poet varying his primary pattern, or her or their primary pattern, for a certain effect. This poem is very much about time, the relationship of the speaker to time. So this idea of the when is important. I'm not talking about iambic pentameter in this particular lecture, however. I'm simply introducing iambic pentameter as an example of a primary line form that we'll see over and over in traditional English poetry, but also to use it as an example of accentual syllabic verse. An accentual syllabic line is one where there is a set number of syllables and a set number of stresses. In an iambic pentameter line, the number of syllables is set, 10. And the number of stresses is set, 5. So much of the traditional verse we will look at is accentual syllabic. How did this happen? Most very early English poetry, Old English poetry, Beowulf, the Wanderer, the Seafarer, these are written in a line known as an accentual line, meaning that there are a set number of accents in the line, but the syllables of the lines vary from line to line. So even though you have 4 accents in the first, say, 4 lines, the first line might be 10 syllables, the next line might be 11 syllables, the next line might be 7 syllables, the next line might be 5 syllables. I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Well, when the Norman Conquest occurred, 1066, suddenly in the English courts, people were speaking French. And the French language starting having an influence on English prosody. Now, prosody is a word we can use to talk about metrical patterns in poems. French is mainly French poetry at the time. We're talking the early modern age, was largely, not largely, but it had a tendency to be syllabic, meaning that as opposed to accentual verse, same number of accents, different number of syllables, syllabic verse is same number of syllables, different number of accents. Now, English doesn't work well with syllabic verse. We don't see many poems in English in syllabic because English is such a stressed language. Lots of hard consonants, lots of really potent monosyllabic words, rock, stone, tree. So English tends to be a stressed language. So Chaucer, coming along really kind of the transitional period between what we call the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Chaucer blends the accentual verse of Old English and the syllabic verse of French language to create iambic pentameter, and he wrote his Canterbury Tales in this verse form, largely. Now, it's not this simple. I'm making broad generalizations here in order to make a point about some of the accentual verse I'm going to talk about in a minute. But that's a brief history where you have Old English thriving in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, the great epic Beowulf being a primary example. Then suddenly Norman Conquest, 1066. And throughout the 11th, 12th, 13th century in England, you have a hard influence of the French language, and Chaucer, being a product of the French takeover, is able to combine the accentual and the syllabic into accentual syllabic verse, and we're back to iambic pentameter. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about accentual verse, because if we can learn what accentual verse is, it won't be too difficult to learn then what accentual syllabic verse is. So as I said, Accentual verse is verse where the poem features a set number of stresses, usually 4, but a varying number of syllables. And some of the most graspable examples of accentual verse take the form of nursery rhymes. Ba ba black sheep. Ba ba black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. 1 for the master, 1 for the swain, or the dame, 1 for the little boy who lives down the lane. Ba ba black sheep. First line, 4 stresses, 4 syllables. Have you any wool? Have you any wool? 4 stresses, 5 syllables. Yes, sir. 4 stresses, 4 syllables. 3 bags full. 3. 1 for the master. 4 stresses, 5 syllables. 1 for the master. I would say there are 3 stresses there. 1 for the dame. Maybe 3 stresses there, 5 syllables. You see, these patterns aren't the same in every line. There has to be variation for aesthetic effect. It doesn't have to be, but it's nice, isn't it? 1 for the little boy, 7, who lives down the lane, 5. We can see another example of this accentual verse in another one. Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I went. Starlight, star bright. First star I see tonight. I wish I may, I wish I might have the wish I wish tonight. Starlight, star bright. 4 stresses, 4 syllables. First star I see tonight. 4 stresses, 5 syllables. I wish I may, I wish I might. 4 stresses, 8 syllables. Have the wish I wish tonight. 7. So again, I'm really emphasizing the stresses here. If I were reading this in a more relaxed and I might say natural way, though natural is a problematic word, I wouldn't say starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. No, I would say starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. Wish I may, wish I might. Have the wish I wish tonight. So sometimes the meter is in the background, and sometimes we don't hit every stress as hard as we would every other stress. So there, as I said, Old English poetry was most dependent upon the 4 stress line. And usually in an Old English line, you would have a line, the first half of which would have 2 stresses, and there would be a caesura or a pause in the line, often marked by punctuation or just a gap in the text. And then you would have 2 other stresses in the next part of the line. Sometimes 3 out of these 4 stresses would alliterate, meaning they would be recurring consonant sounds. Now, because my pronunciation of Old English isn't so great anymore, I had to learn it in grad school. That was a long time ago. And since my ability to translate Old English isn't so great anymore, I'm not going to show you how accentual verse shows up in, say, Beowulf or the Seafarer or the Windhover. But the Wanderer. But what I will do is I'll read some of Ezra Pound's translation of the Seafarer, and we can get a flavor of this Old English accentual verse. May I for my own self songs true reckon, journeys jargon, but I in harsh days hardship endured oft. Her breast cares I have abided. May I for my own self songs truth reckon. 10 syllables, 4 accents. Journeys, jargon, how I in harsh days, 9 syllables. Hardship endured oft, 5 syllables. Bitter breast cares I have abided, 9 syllables. So again, I hit 4 accents in each of those lines, and I counted how the syllables differ from line to line. That's accentual verse. A couple more examples. After the Middle Ages and the early modern period, accentual verse was not so prominent in English poetry. You see it from time to time. You see it in a very powerful example in Coleridge's poem Christabel, which he based on the medieval ballad form. He also based Round the Ancient Mariner on the medieval ballad form. Ballads, by the way, kind of popular folk songs, tend to be accentual. So Coleridge tells us in his preface to Christabel that each line has basically the same number of accents but different number of syllables. So the first few lines go like this. "'Tis the middle of the night by the castle clock, and the owls have awakened the crowing cock. To wit, to woo, and hark again the crowing cock. How drowsily it crew." So the first line, "'Tis the middle of the night by the castle clock," 12 syllables, 4 accents. "And the owls have awakened the crowing cock," 11 syllables, 4 accents. "To wit, to woo," 4 syllables, 4 accents. "And hark again the crowing cock," 8 syllables, 4 accents. "How drowsily it crew," 6 syllables, 4 accents. Now, Gerard Manley Hopkins, a late 19th century English poet, tried to bring accentual verse back. He called it sprung rhythm. And so sometimes in the midst of a very long line with a lot of syllables, he would ask readers only to emphasize 4 of those syllables. And sometimes he would actually mark the syllables he wanted us to emphasize, which makes for some really dynamic and interesting reading that goes against expectation. A most notable example of this would be the first lines of Hopkins' sonnet, "The Windhover," where he praises a falcon as a manifestation of God's power. "I caught this morning morning's minion, kingdom of daylight, dolphin, dapple dawn-drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him, steady air, and striding high there, how he runs upon the vein of a wimpling wing. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dolphin, dapple dawn-drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him, steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the vein of a wimpling wing." So the first line is 10 syllables. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom. There's a dash after king. There's a line break, word breaking. 16 syllables is the next line. Dumb, kingdom, of daylight's dolphin, dapple dawn-drawn falcon in his riding. 16 syllables, 4 accents. Now you can make choices to accent other syllables. This is not mathematical. This is not mechanical. There is subjectivity involved in these choices, always. But this is my interpretation of the stresses that I think Hopkins would want us to make. I can't know that. And this is something that I should have said earlier in this talk, is that, yes, there are some metrical patterns that are pretty clearly that metrical pattern or nothing else, but there are others that are up for interpretation. And that's one of the joys of scanning, is trying to figure out what interpretation best fits your reading. So I won't do the next 2 lines. I think we have a sense of Hopkins. And finally, I'll say that a lot of old-time music, bluegrass music, mountain music, folk music is accentual. Going all the way back to those medieval ballads that still live in the Appalachian Mountains to this day. They made their way from medieval England to Appalachia, largely in the 19th century, but in much different forms. So it makes sense that a lot of this old-time music would be in the form of accentual verse. Now, a lot of other popular music is in accentual verse too, and we'll look at that when we get more deeply into scansion. A lot of hip hop occurs in an accentual form, we'll find. But one of my favorite old time songs is The Cuckoo Bird. Gonna build me a log cabin on a mountain so high, so I can see Willie as he goes on by. Oh, the cuckoo is a pretty bird. She wobbles as she flies. She never hollers cuckoo till the 4th day of July. Clarence Ashley has an amazing version of this song, so haunting. Gonna build me a log cabin, 8 syllables, 4 stresses, on a mountain so high, 6 syllables, 4 stresses, so I can see Willie, 6 syllables, 4 stresses, as he goes on by, 5 and 4. Oh, the cuckoo is a pretty bird, 9 and 4. She wobbles as she flies, 6 and 4. She never hollers cuckoo, 7 and 4, till the 4th day of July, 7 and 4. So now you're ready not only to appreciate a little bit about how accents can work in a poetic line, but now you're ready to move into more accentual syllabic prosody. And in a talk coming up soon, I'll give some examples of iambic pentameter, but most importantly, I'll give some examples of how poets set up an expectation for iambic pentameter in a poem, but then violate that expectation for aesthetic effect. And remember, what I'm showing you here, these stresses I'm hitting, they may not be exactly the stresses that you would hit, and that's okay. There is no one way necessarily to scan a line. There is ambiguity there. And that's one of the great joys of scanning, is trying to play around with how a metrical pattern might contribute to or not contribute to a meaning of a poem that you think is there.